Hey, everybody. I am obviously out of school today, so I thought I would make a video to go over the rest of photosynthesis with you. Um, so I wore this hat because it's green. Um, and also because the Eagles beat the Giants. Sorry if you like the Giants. Got to make better life decisions. And I'm sick. I'm getting better. Hopefully, we'll be back soon. But uh, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I will be pushing the test back till Wednesday or Thursday of next week. We originally talked about Monday or Tuesday, just so you know. So since I missed some time to give you a bit more time, but I wanted to go over the rest of photosynthesis in this video. So last class when I was there, we went over this slide on essentially the overview of photosynthesis. And I emphasized how there's really three questions you should be asking. And they're earlier in the notes. What goes into each step? What comes out of each step? And how do we get from what went in to what went out, right? And so we went over the light reactions. That's the first step. And the Calvin cycle, and just looked at what's going in and what's going out on this slide. Now we're going to focus on the steps individually, right? Starting with the light reactions, also known as the light dependent reactions, because they depend on light. All right. So thinking about these reactions, I didn't actually put this on this slide somewhere. So something important to note that these happen on the thylakoids. The thylakoids are these thin disc like structures in the chloroplast. They're shown on a slide earlier in these notes. And each chloroplast will have many of these thylakoid discs stacked on top of each other for the purpose of maximizing surface area so that you can have a lot of area to absorb light. Because that's really what we're doing here. We're absorbing that energy from the light. Remember, photosynthesis is going to convert light energy, so energy from the light, which is energy in waves, right, into chemical energy, which means energy stored in bonds. So how do we get from light energy, energy in waves, to energy stored in bonds? Well, the first thing that's going to happen, as we look over here, we see light is striking molecules of chlorophyll. And so those green circles represent chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is clustered together as part of what's called a photosystem. A photosystem is basically a group of molecules that serves this purpose. This first one happens to be photosystem 2. We'll see photosystem 1 in a second. But so light strikes these chlorophyll molecules. And when a chlorophyll molecule absorbs light, like really any molecule, when it absorbs energy, what happens is the electrons of that molecule get excited. Now, if you remember from chemistry, you might remember that when electrons get excited, they may start to like jump energy levels, basically move farther away from the nucleus. And that's what happens in chlorophyll. And they get so much energy that they can actually move from one chlorophyll molecule to the next. So what you see happening here is these electrons essentially jumping from one chlorophyll molecule to the next, to the next, to the next, until finally they reach what we call this primary electron acceptor molecule, right? So light energy absorbed by chlorophyll gets excited, or the electrons get excited and they start jumping around, right? Then the question becomes, all right, so now that energy has been transferred really from the light to the electrons. What are the electrons? What's the energy in those electrons going to be used to do? Right? Well, we'll come back to that part. Those electrons are going to move down an electron transport chain. This electron transport chain has a whole lot in common with the electron transport chain that we saw in cellular respiration. And the energy of these electrons is going to be used to produce ATP in very much the same way as happened in cell respiration. I'll give you a little bit of detail on the next slide of how that happens, but you're gonna notice it's a lot the same as cell respiration. So if we understand the electron transport chain from cell respiration, we'll probably understand it from in photosynthesis. The second part of the light-dependent reactions is what we have going on here in photosystem 2, or 1, sorry. Photosystem 1 actually happens after photosystem 2. It doesn't make any sense. I agree. This photosystem just happened to be discovered before photosystem 2, so they named this one 1 and that one 2. Still doesn't really make sense because I'm sure when they initially named it, they only named it photosystem. So why did it to be photosystem 1? I don't know. But either way. So at the same time that light is striking photosystem 2, it's also going to be striking photosystem 1. Right? Light, visible light from the sun comes in wavelengths between about 350 and 720 or 760 nanometers. That whole like Roy G. Biv spectrum, all the colors of light are in between those wavelengths, and certain wavelengths of light get absorbed by chlorophyll, right? Photosystem 2, this P680, that's the wavelength of light that it absorbs maximally, and this one absorbs P700 nanometer of wave light maximally. Not all that, certainly not important to know the exact wavelength, but they do absorb slightly different colors of blue light, basically. But when the light strikes photosystem 1, those electrons also get excited, and they also go to a primary electron acceptor. So you'll notice both photosystems absorbing light, electrons get excited, they go to a primary electron acceptor. The difference here in photosystem 1 is that when those electrons move down a short electron transport chain, they are used by an enzyme to reduce NADP plus to become NADPH. So remember, reduced means gain electrons. So NADP plus gains electrons to become NADPH. All right, so that's what we have going on here. We've added a high energy electrons to really an electron carrier molecule. And this NADPH, we're going to see, serves a similar role to what we saw NADH doing in cellular respiration, bringing high energy electrons to another stage in the process. And they get those electrons from photosystem 1 here that got excited by the light. So really, the energy from the light is now in two places. Right? Some of that energy from photosystem 2 has been used to make ATP, and from photosystem 1 has been used to make NADPH. Right? Now, one of the challenges here, right? So at the end of the electron transport chain in cell respiration, we had oxygen as a final electron acceptor. Remember, the electrons had to have somewhere to go, and if they didn't have somewhere to go, that became a problem, and that's why we have fermentation in the absence of oxygen. Well, in the light-dependent reactions, the electrons that get excited from photosystem 2 end up moving down the electron transport chain and eventually fill in photosystem 1. And the electrons that get excited in photosystem 1 eventually flow to NADPH. So we kind of have this electron flow from photosystem 2 down the electron transport chain to photosystem 1, get excited again, down a short electron transport chain, and end up in NADPH. But if we don't have a source of electrons, eventually photosystem 2 would quote unquote like run out of electrons. So where is it going to get its electrons from? That's the role of water. The reason that plants need water for photosynthesis is water supplies the electrons. So there is an enzyme that will split the bonds in water in H2O, the bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen. And remember, bonds are made of electrons. So when that bond is broken, those electrons fill in photosystem 2. So light is a source of the energy. Water is a source of the electrons. The product of water being split is to ultimately end up giving off oxygen gas. So the reason that plants make oxygen in photosynthesis is because of the splitting of water. So the oxygen comes directly from the oxygen gas, O2, comes directly from the splitting of two water molecules to give you those two atoms of oxygen. All right, so looked at a little bit differently. This slide looks at those light reactions in the exact same way, but now we're kind of zoomed in on that thylakoid. So this membrane that I'm tracing with my mouse here, that is the membrane of the thylakoid. And if you look at it, you'll see some things we saw in the last slide. We have photosystem 2. Notice they're all kind of clustered together in this protein. That's what the photosystem looks like. Those electrons get excited. They move down the electron transport chain to photosystem 1. Now notice what happens here. As those electrons get excited in photosystem 2 and move down the electron transport chain to photosystem 1, that energy from those electrons is used to pump H plus ions or used to pump protons into the thylakoid, thereby creating a high concentration of protons or H plus ions inside the thylakoid. Now, if you remember, when you have a high concentration of protons in an area, they would, just like anything, they would like to spread out. They would like to diffuse, but they can't go across the membrane on their own. So we have our friend from cell respiration, the same protein, ATP synthase, embedded in the membrane. And so these H plus ions are able to diffuse across the ATP synthase and produce ATP in the same way as they did for cell respiration. So notice high energy electrons used to pump protons. Protons then can diffuse, high concentration created. The protons can diffuse through ATP synthase. Then, by the way, those protons end up right back out here. And if you get more light energy and more electrons from water, you could just keep this process going. All right, and then those electrons that eventually end up in photosystem 1 get re-excited by light and end up in NADPH. And so the whole goal of the light reactions is to produce NADPH and ATP that have energy from the light, and in the case of NADPH is storing high energy electrons. Those electrons ultimately came from the water. And the reason we need ATP and NADPH is because they're going to become necessary for the second step of photosynthesis, known as the Calvin cycle. Right? Now, before I explain too much about the Calvin cycle, thank you for staying with this video so far. Right? If you are watching this in class, this is an important message. Right? If you send me an email and tell me your favorite holiday time dessert, all right, by the end of class today, you will get extra credit. I am awarding 24 extra credit points to your class. If everybody emails me, everyone will get 1 point. If only one person emails me, because only one of you watched this video in class, like it tells you in Google Classroom, you will get all 24 points extra credit. So send me the email, but do not tell your friends to email me. All right? Because if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, that's on them. Hog all the extra credit for yourself, because the holidays are all about what you can get, not what you can give to everybody else, of course. All right, so that was sarcasm, but still, it's extra credit. It's every man and person for themselves. So hopefully everybody's watching this, because that's what you should be doing. Anyway, back to the second part. So this slide just describes what I talked about. This is directly from the College Board, what you need to know about the light-dependent reactions. So there's nothing really new on either of these 3 slides about the light-dependent reaction. They're kind of the things I just went over with the diagrams. Right. And that takes us to the Calvin cycle. Now, this is a more complex view of the Calvin cycle than you really have to know. So don't get lost with all this stuff in the middle that has a bunch of complex names that you're not going to be responsible for. So what are the keys? We're going to keep this relatively simple. Remember that photosynthesis' entire goal is to make organic compounds. And so in order to make organic compounds, you need energy and you need carbon. Right? And then you need to store that energy in the bonds between the carbon atoms. And so our carbon source for the Calvin cycle is carbon dioxide. And so here is where carbon dioxide comes into photosynthesis. It is not necessary until the second part, which is known as the Calvin cycle. By the way, the Calvin cycle is happening in the chloroplast also, but it's not happening in those discs, the thylakoids. It's happening in the fluid portion surrounding those discs called the stroma. That's the fluid portion that surrounds the thylakoid disc inside the chloroplast. And there is an enzyme that's going to take each carbon dioxide molecule and attach it to a organic compound that already exists here in the stroma, right? And through a series of reactions, the energy from the ATP that we made in the light-dependent reactions and the electrons from the NADPH, which we made in the light reactions, along with a series of enzymes, are going to be used to ultimately produce a 3-carbon sugar. For every 3 carbon dioxide that comes in, we're able to get a 3-carbon sugar by a series of reactions that ultimately is taking this inorganic carbon that's part of carbon dioxide and doing what's called carbon fixation. Carbon fixation is basically getting inorganic carbon and making it into an organic compound using the energy from ATP and also the high energy electrons from NADPH, and storing those electrons between those carbon atoms to ultimately get this 3-carbon sugar that we call G3P, which is an abbreviation for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. This 3-carbon molecule is really the raw material that plants are able to use to make all other organic compounds, or at least one of the raw materials. So, for example, think glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. With 2 G3P molecules, the plant is able to take those 2 3-carbon molecules and make 1 glucose. What else does the plant make? Well, it makes starch. What's starch? Oh, it's many glucose monomers linked together by dehydration. So once you make glucose, now the plant can store it as starch. What else does the plant make? Oh, it makes cellulose for its cell wall. Oh, that's made up of glucose. The plant could dehydrate a bunch of glucose together to make cellulose, right? And on and on and on. Almost everything the plant makes, every organic compound it makes, can be traced back to this Calvin cycle. What does the Calvin cycle need? It needs carbon dioxide for the carbon, and it needs the energy from the ATP and the NADPH to ultimately store in that 3-carbon sugar that it produces. Right? Now notice, we also end up producing ADP in a couple spots of the Calvin cycle and NADP+. Those can then just go back to the light-dependent reactions and reattach a phosphate to make more ATP, or pick up electrons again to make NADPH. And the light reactions can keep fueling the Calvin cycle as long as we have a constant input of water and light, and obviously also of carbon dioxide. And that is photosynthesis, right? So I will almost definitely, I'm definitely doing better. We'll hopefully be back next class, and we will spend some time reviewing this a little bit. The next thing you have is a Gizmo lab on photosynthesis. That's pretty straightforward, that you can be working on. I also mentioned that you could be taking the first quiz. I think I messed up how that was assigned maybe on Friday if anybody tried to, but now that should be fixed. So you're welcome to take that first quiz. We will have class Friday and Tuesday to also get ready for our test on Thursday, and there's no new material to cover, so there should be time for us to do that. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.